In the small, quiet corner of her world, she was a giant. The old upright piano, a hand-me-down from a grandmother she barely remembered, was her castle, her confidant, and her voice. Her name was Elara, and in the bustling hallways of her high school, she was a ghost. But here, in the soft, golden light of the late afternoon that streamed through the living room window, she was everything. The room would be still, save for the dance of dust motes in the sunbeams and the storm of sound she coaxed from the worn ivory keys. Her fingers, which often fumbled with the zipper on her jacket or trembled when a teacher asked her a question, moved with a certainty and grace that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. They knew the path, pressing down on the keys with a firm yet gentle touch, calling forth the raw, beautiful ache of a Chopin nocturne. The music wasn't just sound. It was a language. It was the argument she wished she could have, the tears she never let fall, the joy she kept hidden away. When she played, the tightness in her chest would loosen, and the constant buzzing anxiety in her mind would finally fall silent. The vibrations of the strings traveled up through the wooden bench and into her bones, a comforting hum that told her she was real, she was here, and she had something to say. This was her sanctuary, a place where the shy, awkward girl who couldn't meet anyone's eyes could command the attention of the entire universe, one note at a time. But the moment the final chord faded and the last vibration settled, the spell would break. The giant would shrink back into the ghost. Elara would pull her hands away from the keys as if they were suddenly hot, tucking them into the sleeves of her oversized sweater. The confidence would drain out of her, leaving behind the familiar, hollow ache of her everyday self. She would look around the room, no longer seeing a stage but just the familiar, cluttered living space. The half-finished painting on the easel in the corner, the stack of books her father was reading on the coffee table, the faint smell of dinner starting from the kitchen, it all reminded her of the world she had to rejoin, a world where she felt small and invisible. At school, she was a master of blending in. She wore muted colors, kept her head down, and spoke in a voice so quiet that people often had to ask her to repeat herself, which only made her want to speak less. She had a few friends, kind girls who would save her a seat at lunch. But even with them, she felt like a spectator at a movie of her own life, watching everything happen from a slight distance. The real Elara, the one with the powerful voice and the storm of emotions, was locked away inside that old piano, waiting for the sun to dip low enough for her to be set free. This stark contrast made her music class a special kind of torture. It should have been her haven, the one place where her passion might be seen and understood. Instead, it was a cold, sterile room ruled by Mr. Harrison, a man who seemed to have a personal grudge against joy. He wasn't old, but he carried himself with a weary slouch that suggested he had been disappointed by life for a very long time. His hair was perpetually messy, his shirt was always untucked, and his eyes, a flat, listless gray, seemed to look right through you, finding you wanting before you even spoke. It was an open secret that Mr. Harrison had once dreamed of being a concert pianist. The story went that he had studied at a prestigious conservatory, full of fire and ambition, only to have his dreams extinguished by some combination of bad luck and a rival with more connections. Whether the story was true or not, it perfectly explained the cloud of bitterness that hung over him like a cheap cologne. He walked through the hallways with a scowl, and his classroom, with its faded posters of long-dead composers and its air thick with the smell of old paper and resignation, felt like the physical manifestation of his soul. For Elara, his class was a minefield. She would always choose the same seat, tucked in the far back corner, behind a tall boy who played the trumpet and was always slumped over his phone. She would make herself as small as possible, praying that Mr. Harrison's gaze would skip over her. He had a particular talent for mockery, a way of lacing his feedback with just enough humor to make the other students snicker, while twisting the knife deep into the heart of his victim. He would lean against the piano, a smirk playing on his lips, as a nervous student attempted a scale. "Ah, a creative interpretation of C major," he might say, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did the notes get rearranged on the way to your fingers?" The class would titter, and the student's face would turn a deep, painful shade of red. Elara would watch, her own heart pounding in sympathy, and feel a sickening dread coil in her stomach. She knew her music was fragile, a private thing made of glass. She couldn't bear the thought of Mr. Harrison holding it up to the light, examining its flaws, and then smashing it to pieces in front of everyone. So she kept her hands down, her head low, and her passion a secret, hiding in plain sight in the one place she desperately wanted to shine. She would sit there, a quiet girl in a gray sweater, while the music she truly felt screamed silently inside her, waiting for a chance to be heard. The day of the in-class performance assessment began under a sky the color of wet cement. A steady, miserable rain tapped against the windows of the school, a sound that usually soothed Ilara, but today it felt like a countdown. Inside the music room, the air was thick with a familiar tension, a mix of teenage apathy and the specific dread that Mr. Harrison seemed to generate all by himself. He was in a particularly foul mood, pacing the front of the room like a caged wolf, his hands clasped behind his back. Every so often he would stop and glare at the class, his eyes lingering on a student just long enough to make them squirm in their seat. Ilara, as usual, had claimed her spot in the far corner, trying to become one with the faded wallpaper. She could feel her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs, a frantic drum solo that had nothing to do with music. She had spent the entire night before practicing, not for the grade, but out of a desperate need to feel that familiar comfort, that sense of control the piano gave her. Now, the thought of playing for this man in this room made her feel sick. Mr. Harrison clapped his hands once, a sharp, cracking sound that made everyone jump. "All right, let's get this over with," he grumbled, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Voluntary performances. Who wants to go first and get it out of the way?" A profound silence fell over the room. No one moved. No one even breathed too loudly. He scanned the room, a predator looking for the weakest member of the herd. His eyes skipped over the confident trumpet player, the chatty girls who sang in the choir, and then they landed on Ilara. A small, cruel smile touched the corner of his lips. It was a look she knew all too well. He had found his target. Just as he was about to open his mouth, a hand shot up a few rows in front of her. It was Maya, a bright, bubbly girl who played the flute and had always been kind to Ilara. "Mr. Harrison," Maya said, her voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "Ilara has been working on a really beautiful piece. I think she should play." The blood drained from Ilara's face. Her head snapped toward Maya, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. But Maya wasn't looking at her. She was smiling at the teacher, a well-meaning but utterly disastrous act of friendship. Mr. Harrison's smile widened. It was the smile of a fisherman who had just been handed a net. "Ilara," he said, drawing her name out slowly, savoring it. Well, it seems we have a hidden prodigy in our midst. Come on up. Don't be shy." Every eye in the room was now on her. She could feel their gazes like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. She wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear, to become the dust motes dancing in the bleak light. But Maya had turned around now and was giving her a thumbs up, her face full of genuine encouragement. How could she explain that this wasn't encouragement? It was a death sentence? With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like inhaling glass, Ilara pushed her chair back. The scraping sound against the linoleum floor seemed to echo in the deafening silence. The walk to the grand piano at the front of the room was the longest journey of her life. Each step was a monumental effort. She could feel a drop of sweat trickle down her temple. The piano loomed ahead of her, not as a beautiful instrument, but as a cold, black monster with gleaming white teeth ready to bite. She sat down on the cold leather bench. It felt slick and unwelcoming, nothing like the worn, comfortable wooden bench at home. She placed her trembling fingers on the keys. They felt foreign, clumsy. She tried to remember the piece, the Chopin nocturne she knew so well, the one that flowed from her soul when she was alone. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to block out the room, to find that quiet place inside her. But all she could see was Mr. Harrison's face, his smirk, the expectant, and in some cases, hungry faces of her classmates. Her mind was a complete blank. The music was gone. She forced her fingers to move, pressing down on the first few notes. They came out shaky and unsure, a ghost of the melody they were supposed to be. She tried to push through, to find her footing, but her fingers wouldn't listen. It was as if they had been disconnected from her brain. A note came out horribly sharp, a jarring, ugly sound that made her flinch. Then another wrong note followed, and another. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a cascade of failure. The beautiful, flowing melody she had practiced 100 times was collapsing into a chaotic mess of discordant noise. The music wasn't just bad. It was wounded. It was the sound of her own panic, made audible for everyone to hear. Before she could even try to stop and restart, a loud, barking laugh cut through the air. It was Mr. Harrison. "Enough, enough," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "I believe you've just tortured that poor piano into submission." He walked over and leaned against the side of the piano, looking down at her. His voice was laced with a false pity that was far more cruel than any shout. "Perhaps we should leave the profound emotion to the professionals," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or at least to those who can find the right keys." A few snickers rippled through the room. They were like little needles, pricking her skin all over. She saw Maya's face fall, her expression a mixture of horror and guilt. But Alara couldn't focus on that. The only thing she could hear was Mr. Harrison's voice, replaying in her head, over and over. Asterisk tortured the poor piano. Find the right keys. Asterisk a hot, burning wave of humiliation washed over her, so intense it felt physical. Her face was on fire. Her throat tightened, and she could feel the prickling sensation behind her eyes that signaled the start of tears. She couldn't cry here. Not in front of him? Not in front of everyone. She didn't think. She just reacted. With a guttural sob she couldn't contain, she shot up from the bench, knocking it over with a loud clatter. She didn't look back. She ran. She fled the classroom, the sound of his mocking laughter and the snickers of her classmates chasing her down the hall like a pack of wild dogs. She didn't stop until she reached the girls' restroom at the far end of the building, slamming the door shut behind her and collapsing into a stall. Finally, alone in the cold, sterile-smelling space, she let the tears come. They weren't just tears of embarrassment. They were tears of pure, heartbroken devastation. He hadn't just mocked her playing. He had taken her sanctuary, the one place where she was strong and beautiful and whole, and he had poisoned it. He had turned her music into a source of pain. And in that moment, huddled on the cold tile floor, she felt like it had been stolen from her forever. The days that followed were like a long, gray winter inside Alara's heart. The old upright piano, once her castle and her confidant, now stood in the corner of the living room like a silent black monument to her shame. A fine layer of dust began to settle on the polished wood, a testament to the days that turned into a week and then two. The house felt different, quieter, in a way that was heavy and sad instead of peaceful. The vibrant storms of sound that used to fill the afternoons were gone, and in their place was a suffocating silence. Ilara would come home from school, her shoulders slumped, and immediately retreat to her bedroom, carefully avoiding even looking at the instrument. It was as if it had the power to hurt her from across the room, its ivory keys holding the memory of her failure and the echo of Mr. Harrison's cruel laughter. At school, life became a masterclass in avoidance. She feigned sickness on the days she knew there was a music class, her mother feeling her forehead with a worried hand, not quite believing the excuse, but letting her stay home anyway. The few times she couldn't escape, she would sit in her usual corner, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on a crack in the plaster wall. She could feel Mr. Harrison's gaze on her sometimes, a smug, satisfied look that said he had successfully put her in her place. She never looked back at him. She just counted the seconds until the bell would ring, freeing her from the room that now felt like a prison. The humiliation wasn't a fading memory. It was a fresh wound she carried with her every day. In the hallways, she would hear snippets of laughter and feel a paranoid certainty that they were laughing at her. The girl who had tortured the piano. She felt exposed like a walking punchline. And the only way to survive was to become even more invisible than she was before. Her parents watched the change in her with a growing, helpless alarm. The girl who used to hum while she did the dishes now moved through the house like a ghost. The light in her eyes had gone out, replaced by a dull, vacant sadness. Her father tried to talk to her one evening, sitting on the edge of her bed as she stared at the wall. "Honey," he said gently, "is everything okay? You seem distant." She just shrugged, pulling her blanket up to her chin. "I'm just tired," she mumbled, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. How could she explain it? How could she tell them that a man with dead eyes had reached into her chest and ripped out the most important part of her? They wouldn't understand. They would tell her to stand up for herself, to be strong, not realizing that her strength had been completely and utterly broken. So she stayed silent, and the silence became a wall between her and the people who loved her most. A wall built with bricks of shame and mortar of fear. The turning point didn't come with a sudden clap of thunder, but with a quiet, hesitant melody in the dead of night. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the incident. Sleep was a stranger to Alara, and she often found herself wandering the house in the early morning hours, when the world outside was still dark and dreaming. On one such night, drawn by an invisible force she couldn't explain, she found herself standing in front of the piano. The dust was thicker now. She ran a finger over the cool, smooth surface of a key, leaving a clean streak in the gray. The memory of the humiliation was still there, sharp and painful, but underneath it something else was stirring. A tiny, forgotten spark of the love she once felt. She sat down on the bench, the familiar creak of the wood sounding like a sigh. She didn't try to play Chopin. She didn't even try to play a real song. Her fingers, feeling stiff and foreign, pressed down on a few keys. A simple, childlike tune emerged, halting and unsure. It wasn't beautiful. It was barely music. It was a question, a whisper of a sound filled with all the loneliness and confusion she felt. It was the first sound she had made on the piano since that awful day, and it felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. What she didn't know was that in the house next door, an elderly woman was also awake, Mrs. Gable, a retired music teacher with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind, knowing eyes often suffered from insomnia. She sat by her open window, sipping a cup of warm milk when the faint, fragile sound drifted over to her. To anyone else, it might have sounded like a child randomly plunking at a keyboard. But to Mrs. Gable, it was a language she understood perfectly. She heard the hesitation, the pain, and the flicker of something trying to break through. She didn't hear a mistake. She heard a cry for help. The next afternoon, there was a soft knock at the door. Ilara's mother answered it to find Mrs. Gable holding a small pot of bright red geraniums. "Just a little something to brighten up the day," she said with a warm smile. After some polite small talk, Mrs. Gable asked if she could speak with Ilara. Ilara, who had been trying to hide in the kitchen, was called out. She felt a fresh wave of embarrassment, sure that the neighbor had heard her awful, late-night playing. Mrs. Gable didn't mention the music at first. She just sat with Ilara at the kitchen table, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "I used to be a teacher," she said, her voice soft and gentle. "A music teacher, actually. And I learned something very important over the years." She looked at Ilara with a gaze that was full of empathy, not pity. "Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. It's about taking whatever is inside of you, the good and the bad, the joy and the pain, and letting it out. The most beautiful sounds are often the ones that aren't perfect." Ilara looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. Mrs. Gable leaned forward a little. "Someone was cruel to you, weren't they?" she asked, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. The question caught Ilara off guard, and she felt a familiar sting behind her eyes. She just nodded, unable to speak. "A cruel voice can feel very loud," Mrs. Gable continued. "It can feel like it's the only voice in the world. But it's not. It's just one voice, and it's an empty one. Your voice, the one that comes from your heart and through your fingers. That one is full. That one is real. Don't ever let an empty voice silence a real one." Her words were like a key turning in a lock that Alara didn't even know was there. He made me feel like I was a joke, Alara whispered, the words coming out in a rush, the first time she had spoken about it to anyone. He made me feel like my music was worthless. Mrs. Gable reached out and patted her hand. Oh, my dear. He didn't make your music worthless. He just proved he was worthless at understanding it. That music is yours. It belongs to you and no one else. It's your story. And if you want to tell it again, even if it's just to yourself in the middle of the night, you should. Don't let him steal your story. When Mrs. Gable left, the house felt lighter. Ilara walked into the living room and looked at the piano. For the first time, she didn't see a monument to her shame. She saw a friend who had been waiting patiently for her to return. That night, she sat down at the bench. The fear was still there, a tight knot in her stomach. But this time there was something else too, a tiny, steely spark of resolve. She thought of Mrs. Gable's words. Don't let him steal your story. She placed her fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. It was just a simple scale, but as the notes filled the quiet room, she knew she was taking the first step on a long journey back to herself. She wasn't playing for an audience or a grade. She was playing for Ilara, and for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. The following weeks became a gentle, steady rhythm of healing. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Ilara would walk next door, her old piano books clutched under her arm, and step into Mrs. Gable's world. The house was always filled with a soft, welcoming light and the faint, sweet smell of something baking or brewing. It was the complete opposite of the cold, sterile music room at school. Mrs. Gable's piano was an old baby grand, a little scarred and out of tune in a way that made it sound warm and human. The first few lessons were not about playing the right notes. In fact, Mrs. Gable barely had her touch the keys. Tell me what you're feeling, Mrs. Gable would say, pouring 2 cups of chamomile tea. Don't worry about the music. Just tell me. At first, Ilara was silent. But the patience in the old woman's eyes was like a warm blanket, and slowly the words started to come. She spoke about the shame, the feeling of being exposed. The way Mr. Harrison's laughter seemed to be on a loop inside her head. She spoke about the silence in her own house, the dust on the piano keys, the feeling that a part of her had died. Mrs. Gable never interrupted. She just listened, nodding slowly, her hands wrapped around her warm mug. When Ilara finally ran out of words, Mrs. Gable would smile gently. Good, she'd say. Now, let's put that into the music. I don't want you to play this nocturne perfectly. I want you to play me the memory of that day. Play me the fear. Play me the anger. Don't hold back. Let the piano feel it. So Ilara played. And it was messy. It was full of jagged, angry chords and hesitant, tearful melodies. She hit wrong notes, but this time she didn't stop. She poured all her frustration into the sound. Letting the music be as ugly and chaotic as her feelings, Mrs. Gable never once corrected her. She would just say things like, yes, that's it. Let it be loud. Let the whole world hear how angry you are. Or, that's the sound of a broken heart. It's beautiful because it's real. Slowly, something incredible began to happen. As Ilara learned to channel her pain through the keys, the pain itself started to lose its power over her. The music was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a weapon and a tool. It was how she fought back. The Chopin Nocturne, the piece that had been ruined for her, began to change. She started to reclaim it, note by note. It was no longer just a beautiful melody. It was her story. The delicate opening was her old, shy self. The stormy, passionate middle section was her humiliation and her anger. And the return of the calm theme at the end was her emerging strength, a quiet but powerful piece. She was not just playing the notes anymore. She was speaking her truth. One sunny afternoon, as Ilara finished a particularly powerful run-through, her heart pounding and her breath coming in gasps, Mrs. Gable was quiet for a long time. A thoughtful, faraway look was in her eyes. My dear, she said finally, that was more than just good. That was important. She paused, choosing her words carefully. There's a competition coming up. The State Youth Symphony Showcase. It's a very big deal. The final round is held in the main concert hall downtown, the one with the golden ceilings. Ilara's heart sank. The very idea of a competition sent a cold wave of dread through her. "Oh no," she said quickly, shaking her head. Thank you, but no." The image of the classroom, the snickering students, and Mr. Harrison's mocking face flashed in her mind. It was one thing to play for Mrs. Gable in the safe, warm room. It was another thing entirely to put herself in a position to be judged and potentially humiliated all over again. Mrs. Gable leaned forward, her expression kind but firm. "Ilara, listen to me. This is not about winning a trophy. This is not about proving that man wrong. He is a small, bitter person, and his opinion means less than nothing. This is about you. It's about taking the story he tried to ruin and telling it the way it was meant to be told. It's about standing on a stage and letting the world hear the music that is inside of you, the music that is real and honest and powerful. You have a voice now. Don't you want to use it?" Her words echoed in Ilara's mind for the rest of the day. You have a voice now. That night she sat at her own piano at home. The dust was gone. She had been cleaning it every day. She thought about what Mrs. Gable had said. It wasn't about revenge. A part of her, a small, dark part, did want to show Mr. Harrison that he hadn't broken her. But the bigger, stronger part of her wanted to do this for herself. She wanted to feel the power of the music under her fingers in a big, open space. She wanted to share the story she had learned to tell. She wanted to own her nocturne. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time, it wasn't stronger than she was. A quiet, steely resolve was growing inside her, a plant pushing its way up through concrete. She thought of the girl who ran out of the classroom, sobbing with shame. She felt a pang of pity for that girl. She was gone now. In her place was someone who had learned that her pain could be turned into beauty, that her voice was worth hearing. The next day, she walked into Mrs. Gable's house with a new determination in her eyes. "Okay," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll do it." The preparation was grueling but exhilarating. Mrs. Gable helped her with the technical side of things, polishing the rough edges of her performance. But the core of the work was Ilara's own. She practiced for hours, not just with her fingers, but with her whole heart. She would close her eyes and picture the stage, the lights, the rows of empty seats. She would play her story over and over until the music was a part of her, until she could feel it in her bones. The audition process was a blur of nervous energy and focused concentration. She played in small rooms for panels of judges who sat with stoic expressions, their faces unreadable. But Ilara didn't let it intimidate her. She just closed her eyes, found her center, and played her truth. A few weeks later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a letter with bold, black letters, "Congratulations on your selection as a finalist in the State Youth Symphony Showcase." She had done it. She was going to the big stage. A wave of pure, unadulterated joy washed over her, so bright and powerful it made her dizzy. She ran next door to show Mrs. Gable, and the two of them hugged, laughing and crying at the same time. In that moment, holding the acceptance letter, Ilara knew this wasn't the end of her journey. It was the beginning of the final, most important chapter. She was no longer playing to escape the world. She was getting ready to play to claim her place in it. The night of the final round felt different from anything she had ever experienced. Backstage at the Grand Concert Hall was a world of controlled chaos. The air hummed with a nervous energy that was almost electric. Young musicians, some looking as terrified as Ilara once felt, others radiating a confidence she couldn't yet understand, paced the worn carpet. The smell of rosin and floor wax mixed with the faint, dusty scent of old velvet curtains. Through a small gap in the heavy fabric, Ilara could catch glimpses of the world she was about to enter. A vast, cavernous space filled with a sea of empty red seats, all pointing toward a single, gleaming grand piano under a pool of warm light. The golden ceilings, which Mrs. Gable had mentioned, seemed to float high above, catching the light and throwing it back in a soft, ethereal glow. It was magnificent and it was terrifying. Her name was called. A kind stagehand gave her a small, encouraging nod as she waited in the wings. Her heart was beating a familiar, frantic rhythm, but this time it wasn't just the drumbeat of fear. There was something else mixed in, a current of excitement, a sense of purpose. She thought of the girl who ran from the classroom, the girl who let her piano gather dust. She felt a pang of pity for her, not for the person she was now. As she walked across the stage, the soft solace of her shoes making no sound on the polished wood, she didn't try to become invisible. She walked with her head up, her back straight. The journey from the wings to the piano bench was the longest she had ever taken, but she didn't feel the weight of 1,000 eyes. She felt the warmth of the single spotlight as if it were a personal invitation. She sat down on the bench. It was cold and firm, a stark contrast to the worn, welcoming bench at home. For a fleeting moment, a wave of panic washed over her. The memory of Mr. Harrison's smirk flickered in her mind. What if her fingers froze? What if the music died in her throat again? She took a deep, slow breath, the way Mrs. Gable had taught her. She didn't close her eyes. Instead, she looked out at the empty seats, but she didn't see them. She saw the journey that had brought her here. She saw the lonely nights practicing, the tears, the anger, and the quiet, steady guidance of a kind old woman. She wasn't here to prove anything to a bitter teacher or to win a prize. She was here to tell her story. Her fingers, which had been trembling slightly at her sides, settled onto the ivory keys. They were still. They were ready. She began to play the Chopin Nocturne. The opening notes were delicate, almost hesitant. They were the sound of the girl she used to be, quiet and shy, speaking in a whisper. The melody was simple and pure, filled with a gentle sadness that everyone in the hall could feel. It was the sound of longing, of a voice waiting to be heard. The audience leaned in, captivated by the intimacy of the sound. As if they were listening to a secret being shared just with them, then the music began to shift. A storm was gathering. The gentle breeze of the opening melody started to swirl, the harmonies becoming more complex, more agitated. This was the turning point, the moment of conflict. Her fingers, which had been dancing lightly, began to press down with more force. The music grew louder, more passionate. It was no longer a whisper. It was a declaration. She was unleashing the storm of her own making, pouring every ounce of the humiliation, the anger, and the injustice she had felt into the keys. The sound that filled the hall was not just loud, it was raw and powerful. Every chord was a battle cry, every rapid run of notes a torrent of emotion breaking free. This was not the sound of a girl being tortured by a piano. This was the sound of a young woman commanding it, bending it to her will, making it tell the story of her pain and her fight. This was her owning the stage, not with arrogance, but with breathtaking honesty. And then as suddenly as it had begun, the storm subsided. The fiery passion of the middle section gave way to the return of the calm, opening theme. But it was different now. It wasn't the same hesitant whisper. It was deeper, richer, and more profound. It was the sound of peace after a long, hard-fought battle. It was the quiet strength that remains after the storm has passed. The music was filled with a sense of hard-won wisdom, a quiet understanding that comes from surviving. She played the final notes with a gentle certainty, her fingers lingering on the keys as the last vibration faded into the vast silence of the hall. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, there was no sound at all. No one coughed, no one shifted in their seat. The entire audience was held captive by the echo of her story. The silence was more powerful, more validating than any immediate applause could ever be. It was a shared moment of profound emotion, a collective breath held in awe. Then, from the back of the hall, a single person began to clap. It was quickly joined by another, and another, until the entire hall erupted into a thunderous, deafening roar of applause. It was a wave of sound so immense it felt like it could lift the ceiling off the building. One by one, people rose to their feet. The standing ovation was not just for her technical skill. It was for the truth she had shared, the vulnerability she had displayed, and the incredible strength she had shown, Ilara rose from the bench, her heart full. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. She looked out at the sea of standing people, their faces a blur of appreciation and admiration. She gave a small bow, not to the crowd, but to the music itself, to the journey, and to the girl she used to be. As she turned to walk off the stage, her eyes scanned the crowd, a habit she couldn't shake. And there he was, Mr. Harrison. He wasn't in the front row, but he was there, standing with everyone else. His face wasn't smug or mocking. It was just blank, a mask of complete shock. In that moment, Ilara felt no surge of victory, no desire for revenge. She felt nothing but a quiet, distant sense of pity. He was just a man in the crowd now, his voice silenced by the symphony of her own strength. She turned away from him without a second thought and walked into the wings. Backstage, Mrs. Gable was waiting for her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't say a word. She just opened her arms and Ilara walked into them, the exhaustion and the joy of the performance finally catching up with her. They stood there for a long time, just holding each other, a shared understanding passing between them that needed no words. Later, as she walked out of the concert hall into the cool night air, the city lights twinkling above, Ilara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know if she had won the competition, and she found to her surprise that she didn't really care. She had already won. She had walked into the place of her greatest fear and had turned it into the place of her greatest triumph. The piano was no longer just a sanctuary or a weapon. It was simply a part of her, as natural as breathing. The cruel voice that had tried to silence her was now just a distant echo, drowned out forever by the beautiful, powerful, and utterly honest sound of her own music. She was whole, and she was ready for whatever came next.